Breaking this past hour, the judge in President-elect Trump's New York criminal case is now agreeing to delay his sentencing indefinitely. Judge Juan Merchan is also granting the Trump team's request to file a motion to dismiss the case entirely. A new sentencing date has not been set, and Merchan says he will hold off on any immunity decision until arguments from both sides have been reviewed. Now, Trump spokesman Stephen Chung reacting with this statement, quote, "In a decisive win for President Trump, the hoax Manhattan case is now fully stayed and sentencing is adjourned. President Trump won a landslide victory as the American people have issued a mandate to return him to office and dispose of all remnants of the witch case legal hunt. All of the sham lawfare attacks against President Trump are now destroyed, and we are focused on making America great again." That's where the focus should be on this Friday. Hello, everyone. This is Outnumbered. I'm Kayleigh McEnany here with my co-host, Emily Compagno. Also joining us, Dagan McDowell, Fox Business anchor and co-host of The Bottom Line on Fox Business. Tammy Bruce, Fox News contributor and author of Fear Itself. And Todd Pyro, co-host of Fox and Friends First. But first, let's bring in Fox News legal editor Carrie Urban. Carrie, the procedural posture of this case, there was supposed to be a sentencing on November 26th. Trump's lawyers respond and say, no, there are constitutional impediments. He is, after all, about to be the president. This should be dismissed entirely. Now we await the motions on December 2nd to that end. Now, Mark Levin made this point to me, and I think it's an important one. Bragg could have moved to dismiss this case. The judge could have dismissed this case. Now the president's lawyers have to effectively ask to dismiss. This case is dead, waiting for dismissal. So what is Merchan waiting for?
Well, that's a great point. And while today is certainly a positive development for the Trump team, we need to continue to exercise caution in how we approach what Judge Merchan is going to do once these arguments are in before him. And Kayleigh, we already know what both sides are arguing. Donald Trump is arguing it should be thrown out for a number of reasons. The SCOTUS immunity case, the fact that Donald Trump became president, which raises all kinds of constitutional questions, the fact that the Department of Justice has a policy that you can't indict, prosecute a sitting president, and that in the spirit of that policy, the state of New York should take the same approach. And Alvin Bragg's office has already laid out their argument. They said completely openly last week in a letter that they submitted to the court that they plan to oppose Trump's request to throw out the case. And the reason I think we need to exercise caution is because at every step of the way, Judge Merchan has ruled against Donald Trump in one way or the other. Now, of course, legally and politically, he should throw out the case. It's a loser for so many reasons. And both Alvin Bragg's office and I would say Judge Merchan have manipulated the law along the way in order to get the result that they wanted. But we don't know what's going to happen. And in fact, if he were still to rule against Donald Trump and deny this motion to dismiss, you could still see a sentencing date set before Inauguration Day. It would be foolish, but my only point is, let's wait and see what happens here.
That's wild. A sentencing before Inauguration Day. At that point, I would think we would get some sort of Supreme Court intervention. But Carrie, you talk about the reasons this should be dismissed. I want to pull up the New York Times. We have something called prosecutorial discretion in this country. Prosecutors sit down. Would this case similarly situated have been brought, and therefore should I bring it? Well, let's bring in no friend of Donald Trump. That's the New York Times, the esteemed gray lady. And here's what they found. A New York Times review and interviews with election law experts strongly suggest that New York State prosecutors have never before filed an election law case involving a federal campaign. Bringing an untested case against anyone, let alone a former president of the United States, now president-elect, carries the risk that a court could throw out or narrow the case. The case was brought by the prosecutor. The judge did not grant the motion to dismiss. And now Merchan sitting by after an election of the American people. Why have the safeguards failed Donald Trump from day one in Bragg's office?
Because both Bragg and Judge Merchan are operating completely as political animals. It's really that simple. The New York legal system at this point is a facade for a political operation when it comes to Donald Trump. And even, and then this is all against the backdrop of what's happening with Daniel Penny. The priorities of those running law enforcement in New York City and the state overall are they're upside down. And by the way, Kayleigh, when I say sentencing before Inauguration Day, what I mean by that is, in theory, Judge Merchan could still set a sentencing date where he could slap a fine on Donald Trump, for instance, and then be done with the whole thing. Because the worst thing he could do, of course, outside of not dismissing the case, of course, would be to hold a sentencing in some kind over Donald Trump's head throughout the pendency of his presidency, which is not just would be unfair to anyone. But to your earlier question about why this case is, a complete loser on so many levels, let's go over some of these facts. Alvin Bragg's office manipulated the statute of limitations to even get this case going again in the first place. Alvin Bragg's office manipulated the law by converting misdemeanors into felonies in a way that has never been done before in the state of New York to anyone. And then I would say that Judge Merchan manipulated justice itself when he denied Donald Trump the opportunity to even know what he was being convicted of. We still don't know what the underlying felonies were and are. And so those are just some of the reasons why this case should be thrown out. And hopefully Judge Merchan will be wise, both legally and politically, and do the right thing and do just that.
Yeah, it was called the zombie case for a reason, but maybe Alvin Bragg wanted to be Time Man of the Year. Maybe that's what Juan Merchan wants. Who knows? Carrier Bond, thank you.
Thank you.
Emily, what struck me right there was when she mentioned the New York facade of a front for a legal office. And you have someone like Trump who has recourse. He's about to be president. And you think of someone like Daniel Penny, who has no recourse if things don't go his way in the way of what appears to be justice.
Right. I mean, both have appeal. I'll say this. Kerry, of course, did a phenomenal job. So I will just add this. One is that this judge's timeline that he accepted, that was the prosecution's timeline. So defense wanted to submit the motion to dismiss actually a bit later on the 20th. So just think about that essentially the defense has 18 days less than they wanted to compile and submit their motion to dismiss on this, frankly, novel, but you could argue clear case. But that being said, think about the bar that this defense team has to overcome, which is, as Kerry said, they are political animals. So it's not only the legal threshold, but it's absolutely the political animal that is facing them down, that is and always anti-Donald Trump. So their motion to dismiss, they now have a very truncated timeline to compile the facade that this is based on, the legal inaccuracies, the deficiencies, the fraud, and then have their case answered. But to Kerry's point, the judge can come back and simply deny the motion to dismiss, which would be absolutely ridiculous, and then levy some type of nominal sentence that would enable the Democrats to crow about the conviction. And final quick point, the Georgia case that is ongoing, quietly, that court there took off a defense argument or an oral argument actually for the defense challenge off the calendar without explanation. So it seems as if Georgia might be trying to just fade away into the backdrop, knowing how unconstitutional these cases are to begin with and the moving forward would be. And now perhaps New York, I hope they are just trying to save face by the judge being able to grant the motion to dismiss rather than DA Alvin Bragg bringing it himself as he should have. That this would enable them to say, well, we fought hard, but judge ruled in Donald Trump's favor. That's my last bastion of hope I'm clinging to. That would help me restore some faith in this all but just criminal justice system here in this state.
Todd, I do have faith in the United States Supreme Court. And Mark Levin mentioned at some point you could ask SCOTUS to intervene, and they may be chomping at the bit to intervene in what appears to be a political prosecution.
That would revolve around, to a certain extent, the law that they set out on presidential immunity. I agree with Emily. Kerry did a fabulous job on the law. I just want to add one thing. Think of this as a Venn diagram, with all due respect to Kamala Harris. Presidential immunity is the tiny circle. They already have a motion to vacate on the presidential immunity argument. Motion to dismiss is the entire case. That said, the motion to dismiss will involve some elements of presidential immunity. So that's the law. On the politics of it, I disagree with everybody here, because I've talked to a lot of liberals. They're still out for blood. Mm-hmm. They're so upset with what happened on November 5th, and they cannot accept what happened on November 5th, that they're looking for any kind of a win. They want him behind bars. Realistically, that's never going to happen. But they do want some pound of flesh, and that pound of flesh could be a sentencing, whether it's a fine or not. But it's, to your point, it's the ability for them to say he is a convicted felon, and they can call him convicted felon President Trump.
Wait, but answer me this, let's say he doesn't grant the motion to dismiss, but then Trump can appeal that, and then the entire thing would be held in abeyance essentially while the New York Supreme Court then took it on. I mean, right? So
Right.
that's another
I think
option
they're trying
too.
to avoid the appeal because once the sentencing is input, then you get the title convicted felon.
That's their goal.
That's their goal.
But
Right,
that's
but
not
appealing the
Bragg's
motion
goal.
to dismiss, I mean.
Bragg's goal loves that.
So,
Yeah.
Dagan, I do want to, and stop giving me Venn diagram nightmares.
Sure, sorry about
Please,
that.
Todd. Dagan, I do want to bring up the verdict of the American people, and that's the popular vote count for Donald Trump. And you can see here that it has exceeded 76 million, though you have the left trying to poo-poo that. That is the verdict of the American people, and lawfare was a big part of that.
Right, and virtually every state moved further right. I think I went back and looked. Andy McCarthy in April of 2023, so more than a year and a half ago, said this case at the indictment stage should have been dismissed because the indictment itself never stated the underlying crime that was used to bootstrap 34 time-barred misdemeanors into 34 felonies, which is exactly what Kerry was talking about. So it should have gone away before it ever went to trial. But I think about, and the voters think about, all of the resources and man-hours spent pursuing this fraudulent case, this legal warfare against Donald Trump, and all of the victims in New York City who Alvin Bragg did not stand up for, and all of the victims of crimes who have not seen justice because he was pursuing something for his own political gain. This is a sewage lagoon of liberalism. Do not move here. Get the hell out if you can.
Sewage lagoon.
Well, yeah, just like none of us would have wanted really what happened in 2020 to happen with the impact on the country. But in a horrible way, it was necessary for Americans to see what the Democrats were capable of and why Trump was needed. This is similar, that Americans for generations have complained about an unfair justice system and that it's just not fair. You get to public defenders, you have to plead guilty to something you're not guilty of. You have no real recourse. Unless you've got money, you can't really appeal. This is one of those examples every day that Americans have realized. Now you see what we have been dealing with. The irony is for New York and Bragg and Mershon is that that's why Trump is now president, because of what they have done and what they represent.
Well, we went from Venn diagrams to sewage lagoons.
Yeah.
It is Friday, guys.
Hey everyone, I'm Emily Campagno. Catch me and my co-hosts Harris Faulkner and Kaylee McEnany on Outnumbered every weekday at 12 p.m. Eastern, or set your DVR. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Fox News YouTube page for daily highlights.